On the night of March 9th, 1945, 334 B-29 Superfortress bombers lifted off from airfields in the Mariana Islands and set course for Tokyo. The man who ordered this mission was 38 years old, not 58, and weighed considerably less than 210 pounds. His name was Curtis LeMay, and what happened that night would become one of the most devastating single bombing raids in human history. Before the sun rose on March 10th, more than 100,000 Japanese civilians would be dead, 1 million more would be homeless, and 16 square miles of Tokyo would be reduced to ash and rubble. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't collateral damage. This was the plan. Curtis LeMay was born in Columbus, Ohio, in 1906. His father was a drifter, an ironworker who moved the family around constantly, chasing jobs that rarely lasted. The LeMay family lived in poverty, sometimes in homes without running water or electricity. Young Curtis learned early that the world was a hard place, and that survival meant being harder. He was a quiet kid, not given to emotion or sentiment. His face, even as a young man, had that quality of being carved from stone. People who knew him said he never smiled much, never small-talked, never wasted words. He was all business all the time, and the business he chose was military aviation. LeMay enrolled at Ohio State University in 1924, studying civil engineering while joining the Reserve Officers Training Corps. He wasn't a natural student, but he was disciplined. He worked his way through college, taking odd jobs, scraping by. In 1928, he earned his commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Air Corps Reserve. The following year, he went on active duty and began flight training. He took to it like few others did. Flying wasn't romantic to LeMay. It was a technical problem to be solved, a machine to be mastered, and he mastered it. Through the 1930s, LeMay built a reputation as one of the most skilled navigators and pilots in the Air Corps. He was obsessive about precision. On training flights, he would plot courses down to the second, calculate fuel consumption down to the gallon, demand that his crews perform with mechanical perfection. In 1937, he was part of a crew that successfully intercepted the Italian ocean liner Rex more than 700 miles out in the Atlantic, a feat of navigation that made headlines and proved that long-range bombers could find targets far out at sea. This wasn't just showing off. This was LeMay demonstrating that air power could reach anywhere. When World War II began in Europe in 1939, the United States wasn't ready. The Army Air Corps was small, its bombers were outdated, and its doctrine was largely theoretical. But men like LeMay were preparing for what they knew was coming. By the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, LeMay was already a veteran pilot and instructor, already thinking about how to use bombers not just as tactical weapons, but as instruments of strategic destruction. LeMay went to Europe in 1942 as a lieutenant colonel commanding a bomber group in the 8th Air Force. This was the great testing ground for American strategic bombing theory. The idea was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Heavy bombers, flying in tight formations at high altitude, would penetrate deep into enemy territory and destroy the industrial capacity that allowed the enemy to make war. Factories, oil refineries, transportation hubs, power plants. Destroy these, and you destroy the enemy's ability to fight. The bombers would defend themselves with their own machine guns. Fighter escorts would help when they could. And the bombing would be done in daylight, because only in daylight could bombardiers see their targets and hit them with precision. The reality was nothing like the theory. German fighters swarmed the bomber formations. Flak filled the sky with explosive shells. Bombers fell from the sky by the dozens. Crews were killed or captured at horrific rates. And the bombing, despite all the technology and training, wasn't nearly as precise as the doctrine assumed. At 25,000 feet, with the plane shaking from flak bursts and engines straining, and the bomb sight vibrating, Hitting a specific building was nearly impossible. Bombs fell scattered across entire neighborhoods, but LeMay didn't give up on the theory. He adapted it. He developed new formations that concentrated defensive firepower. He demanded that his planes fly straight and level on their bombing runs, no matter how heavy the flak, because evasive action made accurate bombing impossible. He told his crews they had to accept the risk, had to fly into the fire if they wanted to hit the target. This made him deeply unpopular with his men. They thought he was callous, willing to sacrifice them for marginal improvements in accuracy. But the casualty rates in LeMay's groups were actually lower than average because his tight formations and disciplined tactics made it harder for German fighters to pick off stragglers, and his groups hit their targets more often. LeMay understood something that many commanders didn't. In war, sentiment gets people killed. Discipline keeps them alive. By 1944, LeMay was a brigadier general and one of the most respected bomber commanders in Europe. He had personally led some of the most dangerous missions, including the raid on Regensburg in August 1943, where his group flew deep into Germany, bombed a Messerschmitt factory, and then kept going all the way to North Africa because they didn't have enough fuel to make it back to England. He had seen more combat than almost any other general officer. He knew what worked and what didn't, and when the Army Air Forces decided they needed someone to fix the failing bombing campaign against Japan, they sent Curtis LeMay. The B-29 Superfortress was supposed to be the ultimate weapon. It was the most advanced bomber ever built, with a pressurized cabin that let crews operate at extreme altitudes, 4 powerful engines, a range of over 3,000 miles, and the ability to carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. It was designed specifically to attack Japan from distant bases. The problem was that by the summer of 1944, it wasn't working. B-29s based in China and India were flying missions against Japan and achieving almost nothing. The logistics of supplying bases in China were a nightmare. Fuel and bombs had to be flown over the Himalayas. Maintenance was difficult, and when the bombers finally reached Japan, they were bombing from such high altitude, often above 30,000 feet, that they couldn't hit anything. Japan's factories and industrial sites were small and scattered. High-altitude precision bombing, which was hard enough in Europe, was nearly impossible over Japan. In January 1945, LeMay took command of the 21st Bomber Command in the Mariana Islands. By this point, American forces had captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, giving the Air Force's bases within reasonable striking distance of the Japanese home islands. Hundreds of B-29s were stationed there, but the results were still disappointing. The bombers were flying high-altitude daylight raids, trying to hit specific factories and industrial targets, and missing most of them. The weather over Japan was terrible. Clouds obscured targets. The jet stream, 100-mile-per-hour wind at high altitude that meteorologists were just beginning to understand, threw off the bombers' approach and scattered their bombs. Crews were flying long, dangerous missions and coming back with little to show for it. The Air Force brass in Washington was getting impatient. They had spent billions of dollars developing the B-29 and building a fleet of them. They needed results. LeMay looked at the problem with his typical cold logic. High-altitude daylight precision bombing wasn't working. The weather was too bad. The targets were too small. The jet stream was too strong. Fine, change the tactics. The goal wasn't to execute a particular doctrine. The goal was to destroy Japan's ability to make war. So how do you do that? LeMay knew that Japan's industry wasn't like America's or Germany's. Japan didn't have massive steel mills and auto plants. Japanese industry was dispersed. Small factories and workshops were scattered throughout the cities, mixed in with residential areas. Workers assembled parts in their homes. This made precision bombing of specific factories pointless, but it also created a vulnerability. If you couldn't hit the factories, you could hit the cities. And Japanese cities, LeMay knew, were extraordinarily vulnerable to fire. Japanese urban construction was based on wood and paper. Houses were built with wooden frames and walls made of paper screens. They were packed closely together, separated by narrow lanes. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe were essentially vast wooden tinderboxes. They had burned before, many times. Tokyo had been destroyed by fire following the Great Earthquake of 1923. Everyone knew how vulnerable these cities were. The Japanese certainly knew. But there wasn't much they could do about it. You can't rebuild an entire city in stone and concrete when you're fighting a total war, and all your resources are going to the military. LeMay started testing fire raids in late February. On February 25th, he sent bombers against Tokyo loaded with incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. The results were promising. The fires spread quickly. The damage was extensive. But LeMay wanted more. He started thinking about how to maximize the destruction, and he came up with a plan that was radical, risky, and ruthless. First, the bombers would attack at night, not during the day. Night attacks meant the bombers couldn't be seen as easily by fighters or anti-aircraft gunners. It meant they couldn't use precision bomb sites, but LeMay had already concluded that precision was impossible anyway, so why pretend? The target wouldn't be a specific factory. The target would be entire neighborhoods, entire districts. Area bombing. The British had been doing this to German cities since 1942, but the American Air Force had always insisted it was above such tactics, that it bombed only military and industrial targets. LeMay didn't care about the rhetoric. He cared about results. Second, the bombers would fly low, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet instead of 30,000. This was dangerous. It put the planes within range of smaller anti-aircraft guns. But it also meant they could carry more bombs because they wouldn't be burning fuel climbing to high altitude. It meant they could bomb more accurately because they'd be closer to the target. And LeMay had intelligence suggesting that Japanese air defenses were weaker than everyone thought. The Japanese had concentrated their fighters and anti-aircraft guns at high altitudes because that's where American bombers usually operated. If the B-29s came in low, they might slip through. Third, and most controversial, LeMay ordered the bombers to strip out most of their defensive guns and ammunition. The B-29 had 10 machine guns and a cannon for defense. All that weaponry and ammunition added weight. In a night attack flying low, the gunners wouldn't be able to see enemy fighters anyway. So why carry the weight? Take out the guns, take out the ammunition, take out the gunners if you can spare them. Use that weight capacity for more bombs. More bombs meant more fire, and more fire meant more destruction. Fourth, the bombs themselves would be incendiaries. Not the big blockbuster high-explosive bombs, but thousands of small incendiary clusters that would scatter over a wide area and start hundreds of separate fires simultaneously. The M69 incendiary bomb was a 6-pound cylinder filled with napalm, a gelid gasoline that sticks to whatever it hits and burns at extremely high temperature. Each B-29 could carry over 40 clusters of these things, and each cluster held dozens of individual bomblets. Do the math. 300 bombers, each carrying hundreds of incendiaries, all dropped on the same target area in the space of a few hours. The fire departments wouldn't be able to cope. The fires would merge into a conflagration. The whole district would burn. LeMay presented this plan to his staff, and they were skeptical. Flying low was risky. Stripping out the guns was risky. If the Japanese had more fighters than intelligence suggested, or if the anti-aircraft fire was heavier than expected, the losses could be catastrophic. LeMay could lose dozens of planes, maybe 100 or more. That would be the end of his career. But LeMay looked at the numbers and decided the risk was acceptable. He believed the intelligence about Japanese defenses. He believed that surprise and darkness would protect his bombers. And he believed that even if he lost 50 planes, the destruction he would inflict on Tokyo would be worth it. This was the cold calculation. Trade some bombers and crews for the destruction of a major Japanese city. In the terrible arithmetic of total war, it made sense. He picked Tokyo as the target, specifically the working-class neighborhoods of the eastern and northeastern wards. These areas were densely packed with wooden houses and small factories. They were home to more than 1 million people. LeMay knew that a massive fire raid on these neighborhoods would kill thousands of civilians. He knew this, and he accepted it. Some historians later claimed LeMay was troubled by this, that he struggled with the moral implications. But there's not much evidence of that in his own words. LeMay saw himself as a professional doing a job. His job was to destroy Japan's capacity to make war. Civilians who worked in war industries, civilians who lived among war industries, were part of that capacity. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants had been eroding throughout the war on all sides. The Germans had bombed London and Covington. The British had bombed Hamburg and Dresden. The Japanese had massacred civilians throughout China and Southeast Asia. Now it was Japan's turn to experience what modern war meant. On the afternoon of March 9th, 1945, ground crews on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian began loading the B-29s. They loaded them with incendiaries, cluster after cluster. They removed ammunition from many of the gun positions. They fueled the planes for a round trip of about 3,000 miles. The crews were briefed. They were told they'd be flying low, at night, over Tokyo. They were told the target was the industrial and residential districts in the eastern part of the city. They were told to drop their bombs in a specific pattern to maximize the spread of fire. Some crews were nervous. Low altitude meant more danger from flak, but they trusted LeMay, or at least they trusted that he wouldn't throw their lives away casually. The first planes took off around 5:30 in the evening. Wave after wave followed. 334 bombers eventually got into the air. The flight took about 6 hours. The bombers flew individually, not in formation, because they didn't need defensive formations for a night raid. They flew north and west, over the Pacific, navigating by the stars and by radar. As they approached the Japanese coast, crews could see searchlights sweeping the sky. They could see flak bursts. But it was scattered, not concentrated. The Japanese didn't know what was coming. The lead planes arrived over Tokyo just after midnight. They were Pathfinder aircraft, carrying a mix of incendiaries and high explosives. Their job was to mark the target area, to start fires that would guide the following waves of bombers. They dropped their bombs in a giant X pattern across the target zone. Within minutes, fires were burning. The main force of bombers followed, wave after wave, dropping their incendiaries into the marked area. The M69 bomblets scattered across rooftops, into streets, into alleys. When they hit, they burst open and sprayed burning napalm in all directions. The napalm stuck to wood, to paper, to clothing, to skin. It burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Water couldn't put it out. Smothering it was nearly impossible. Within an hour, hundreds of fires were burning across the target area. The fires began to merge. As they grew, they created their own weather. Superheated air rose rapidly, creating powerful updrafts. Cool air rushed in from the sides to replace it, creating winds. These winds fanned the flames and spread the fire faster. Soon, there were fire tornadoes, whirling vortexes of flame that moved through the streets like living things, consuming everything in their path. The temperature in some areas reached 1,800 degrees. Water in canals boiled. Glass melted. Metal twisted. People caught in the open were incinerated instantly. People hiding in shelters suffocated as the fire consumed all the oxygen. People who ran found that every direction led into more fire. The bombers kept coming. For nearly 3 hours, they dropped their loads. B-29 crews flying through the smoke and heat said the smell of burning flesh reached them even at 5,000 feet. They said the updrafts from the fires were so powerful they threw the planes around like toys. Some planes were flipped upside down by the turbulence. Some were damaged by debris sucked up into the air. But only 14 bombers were lost that night, far fewer than LeMay had feared. The Japanese defenses were overwhelmed. The fighters couldn't coordinate in the chaos. The anti-aircraft guns couldn't track targets in the smoke. The raid was, from a military standpoint, a spectacular success. On the ground, it was hell. Families fled their homes and ran through streets that were walls of flame. Parents lost children in the chaos. The elderly and infirm were left behind, unable to escape. People jumped into rivers and canals to escape the heat, and many drowned or were crushed by others doing the same. People huddled in parks and open spaces, but the fire came for them there too. Sparks and embers rained down everywhere. Clothing caught fire. Hair caught fire. The smoke was so thick that people couldn't see more than a few feet. They couldn't breathe. They collapsed and were trampled or burned where they fell. By dawn on March 10th, the fires were still burning, but the worst was over. 16 square miles of Tokyo had been destroyed. That's about 40 square kilometers, roughly the same area as Manhattan from the southern tip to Central Park. In that area, almost everything was gone. Where there had been houses and shops and temples and schools, there was now ash and twisted metal and rubble. Bodies were everywhere. Some were burned beyond recognition. Some were just piles of ash. Many had died from suffocation or heat exposure without being directly touched by flames. The exact death toll will never be known because records were destroyed and many bodies were never identified. Official Japanese estimates said about 80,000 died, but most historians believe the real number was over 100,000, possibly as high as 130,000. That made it the single deadliest air raid in history, deadlier than Hiroshima, deadlier than Nagasaki, deadlier than Dresden. 1 million people were left homeless. They wandered through the ruins looking for family members, looking for anything salvageable. The Japanese government tried to organize relief efforts, but they were overwhelmed. Food and water were scarce. Medical supplies were inadequate. Survivors were left to fend for themselves in many cases. Makeshift shelters sprang up in parks and along riverbanks. The social fabric of entire neighborhoods had been destroyed overnight. LeMay's reaction was simple and direct. The raid had worked. It had worked even better than he had hoped. Tokyo's industrial capacity in the targeted area was gone. The death toll, while horrific, meant that Japan's workforce had been dealt a serious blow, and the cost to American forces had been minimal. 14 planes lost out of 334. Acceptable losses. He immediately began planning follow-up raids. If this tactic worked against Tokyo, it would work against other Japanese cities. And he had plenty of B-29s and plenty of incendiaries. Over the next 10 days, LeMay's bombers hit Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe with similar fire raids. The results were similar. Thousands of civilians dead, square miles of cities destroyed, minimal American losses. The Japanese air defenses, already strained, couldn't cope with the low-altitude night attacks. Japanese industry was being systematically destroyed, not by precision strikes on factories, but by wholesale incineration of the cities where those factories were located. The question that haunts this history is whether it was necessary. LeMay argued, then and for the rest of his life, that it was. Japan in March 1945 was not going to surrender. The Japanese military leadership was committed to fighting to the bitter end. They were preparing for a final defense of the home islands that would cost millions of lives, Japanese and American. Plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, estimated casualties in the hundreds of thousands for American forces alone and millions for Japanese military and civilians. The firebombing campaign, LeMay believed, would break Japan's will to resist. It would show the Japanese people and their leaders that continued resistance was futile. It would save lives in the long run by ending the war sooner. Critics argue that by March 1945, Japan was already defeated. Its navy was destroyed. Its air force was crippled. Its cities were blockaded. It was only a matter of time before Japan would have to surrender, and the fire bombings were simply slaughter for its own sake, or at best a demonstration of American power directed more at the Soviet Union than at Japan. They point out that even after the fire bombings, even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese military leadership was divided about surrender, which suggests that the bombing campaign wasn't as decisive as LeMay claimed. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The fire bombings were part of a larger strategy of pressure. The naval blockade was strangling Japan's economy. The submarine campaign had cut off raw materials. The conventional bombing of oil refineries and transportation networks was crippling mobility. The fire raids added to this pressure by destroying the physical infrastructure of Japanese cities and creating psychological terror. No single element of this strategy was decisive on its own, but together they created a situation where Japanese leaders, even the most hardline, had to face reality. What's undeniable is that Curtis LeMay believed he was doing the right thing. He believed that his duty was to win the war as quickly and efficiently as possible. He believed that the deaths of civilians in war were tragic, but inevitable. He believed that the moral responsibility for those deaths lay with the Japanese government that started the war and refused to end it, not with the American commanders who prosecuted the war. This is a coherent moral framework, though not everyone accepts it. It's the framework of total war, where the distinction between military and civilian targets disappears, because entire societies are mobilized for war. LeMay wasn't a sadist. He didn't enjoy killing, but he didn't lose sleep over it either. He saw himself as a technician, an expert in the application of air power. He had studied the problem of how to defeat Japan from the air, and he had solved it. The solution involved killing a lot of people, but war is about killing people until the other side surrenders. That's the brutal logic of it, and LeMay never flinched from that logic. After the war, LeMay continued to rise through the ranks of what became the United States Air Force. He commanded the Berlin airlift in 1948, orchestrating the massive aerial supply operation that kept West Berlin alive during the Soviet blockade. He became the head of Strategic Air Command in 1948 and transformed it into the most powerful military force in history, the nuclear sword that hung over the Soviet Union for decades. He was Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force in the 1950s and Chief of Staff in the 1960s. He retired as a 4-star general in 1965. He ran for vice president in 1968 on the American Independent Party ticket with George Wallace. They lost badly. LeMay's public image by then was of a warmongering extremist, a bomb them back to the Stone Age militarist. This wasn't entirely fair. LeMay was aggressive, and he believed in military strength, but he wasn't crazy. He understood the limits of military power. But the public saw him through the lens of the Cold War and Vietnam, and they didn't like what they saw. LeMay defended the Tokyo raid for the rest of his life. He never apologized, never expressed regret. He said that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal, and he probably would have been convicted. But the United States won, so he was a hero. That's how war works, he said. The winners write the history. The losers get hanged. He wasn't being cynical. He was being honest about the nature of war and the nature of justice in war. When you look at the raid on Tokyo, you're looking at a hinge point in military history. It was the moment when strategic bombing became strategic burning, when the idea of precision gave way to the reality of annihilation. It was a preview of the nuclear age, when cities could be destroyed in moments and casualties could be counted in the hundreds of thousands. It was the culmination of trends that had been building throughout the war, the erosion of limits, the expansion of targets, the acceptance of civilian deaths as a tool of policy. The men who flew the mission weren't monsters. They were young Americans doing what they were told, fighting a war they believed was just. Most of them didn't know exactly what they were doing that night. They knew they were bombing Tokyo, but they didn't know the full scale of what was happening on the ground. They saw fires, they felt the updrafts, they smelled the smoke, but they didn't see the faces of the people who died. They didn't hear the screams. They went back to their bases, ate breakfast, and slept. Many of them only learned years later about the full extent of the destruction. The survivors of the raid carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Children who lost their parents that night, parents who lost children, people who watched their neighbors burn, people who ran through streets of fire. Their stories are part of the historical record, recorded in Japanese archives and survivor testimonies. They remember the heat that melted skin, the smoke that choked lungs, the terror of being trapped in a burning city with no way out. They remember the bodies piled in the streets, the smell of burned flesh, the silence that came after when the fires finally died and they could see the scale of what had happened. Tokyo rebuilt. By the 1950s, the burned districts were being reconstructed. By the 1960s, Tokyo was a modern city again, one of the great metropolises of the world. The scars of that night faded from the landscape, but they didn't fade from memory. Every year on March 10th, survivors gather at memorial sites to remember the dead. They light incense, they say prayers, they tell their stories to younger generations who never experienced war. The raid raised questions that still haven't been fully answered. What are the limits of warfare? When does a military necessity become a war crime? Who decides? The laws of war, such as they existed in 1945, prohibited the deliberate targeting of civilians, but they also recognized that civilians near military targets might be killed. Where's the line? If a city's industry is dispersed throughout residential areas, is the entire city a legitimate target? If bombing a city will shorten a war and save lives in the long run, is it justified even if it kills civilians in the short run? Different people answer these questions differently. Some say there are absolute moral rules that apply even in war, that certain things are always wrong no matter what the consequences. Others say that war is a realm beyond normal morality, where the only rule is survival and victory. Most people fall somewhere in between, accepting that war involves tragic choices, but insisting that there must be some limits. Curtis LeMay represented one pole of this debate. He believed that once you're in a war, you fight to win with every tool at your disposal. Restraint in war, he thought, just gets your own people killed and prolongs the suffering. The moral thing to do is to end the war as quickly as possible, even if that means doing terrible things. Better a short, terrible war than a long, terrible war. This is a defensible position, though it's not the only defensible position. What's important to understand is that LeMay didn't invent strategic bombing. He didn't invent area bombing. He didn't invent the idea of targeting civilian morale. These concepts had been developing since the early days of air power. Italian theorist Giulio Douhet had written in the 1920s about using bombers to terrorize civilian populations into demanding peace. British Air Marshal Hugh Trenchard had advocated for strategic bombing between the wars. The Germans bombed Warsaw and Rotterdam. The British bombed German cities throughout the war. The Americans had tried precision bombing, but found it didn't work as well as theory suggested. By 1945, all the major powers had accepted that cities were targets and civilians would die. LeMay's contribution wasn't moral or philosophical. It was tactical and technical. He figured out how to maximize the destruction. He understood that Japanese cities were vulnerable to fire and that incendiaries were more effective than high explosives. He understood that night attacks at low altitude would minimize his losses while maximizing damage. He understood that you didn't need to destroy every building in a city. You just needed to start enough fires that they would spread and merge into an unstoppable conflagration. He took the strategic bombing concepts that already existed and made them brutally efficient. The number 100,000 is hard to grasp. It's easier to understand one death than 100,000 deaths. One person has a face, a name, a story. 100,000 is a statistic, but each of those 100,000 was a person with a face and a name and a story. They were children and old people, men and women, shopkeepers and factory workers, students and teachers. They had families and friends. They had dreams and fears. They woke up on the morning of March 9th, not knowing it would be their last day alive. They went about their daily routines. They ate meals, they talked to neighbors, they worried about the war and the shortages and the American bombers that had been hitting Tokyo for weeks. And then the sirens sounded, and they heard the bombers overhead, and they saw the fires start, and they tried to run, and most of them didn't make it. Some were lucky. They were in the wrong part of the city, or they had gone to the countryside to visit relatives, or they managed to find a clear path through the flames and reached safety. They lived to tell their stories. But even for the survivors, that night never really ended. They carried it with them. The guilt of survival, the memory of loss, the trauma of witnessing such horror. Post-traumatic stress wasn't a recognized diagnosis in 1945, but the survivors had it. They had nightmares. They flinched at loud noises. They panicked in crowds. Some never recovered. The Tokyo raid was followed by more raids. Nagoya on March 11th and 13th. Osaka on March 13th. Kobe on March 16th. Then LeMay had to pause. He was running low on incendiaries. The supply line from the United States couldn't keep up with the rate he was burning through them. But by the end of March, 67 Japanese cities had been marked for destruction. LeMay planned to burn them all, one by one, until there was nothing left to burn. In the summer of 1945, the fire raids continued. Smaller cities were targeted because the major ones were already heavily damaged. Places like Toyama and Fukui and Ichinomiya, places most Americans had never heard of. Each raid killed hundreds or thousands. Each raid left thousands homeless. By August, Japan's urban industrial base was largely destroyed. Millions were homeless. The economy was collapsing. Food was scarce. The government was losing control. Then came Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. Atomic bombs, each one doing in a single instant what had taken 300 bombers and 3 hours to do to Tokyo. The atomic bombs get all the attention in history books, but the firebombing campaign had already done most of the work. Japan was already beaten. The atomic bombs just made it undeniable. LeMay later said that if he had had more time, he wouldn't have needed the atomic bombs. He could have burned every city in Japan. He probably wasn't wrong. Whether that would have forced a Japanese surrender is another question. But the capacity was there. The incendiaries were there. The bombers were there. And LeMay had no hesitation about using them. After Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945, LeMay's career entered a new phase. He became the architect of America's nuclear deterrent strategy. He built Strategic Air Command into a force that could destroy the Soviet Union within hours. He believed that the way to prevent nuclear war was to be so strong, so ready, so obviously capable of devastating retaliation that no enemy would dare attack. Peace through strength. Peace through the threat of overwhelming violence. It was the same logic that had guided him over Tokyo, just on a larger scale. Some historians argue that LeMay was a product of his time, that he can't be judged by modern standards. War in the 1940s was total war. Entire societies were mobilized. Distinctions between combatants and non-combatants had broken down. Everyone was either producing weapons or fighting with them. In that context, targeting cities made strategic sense. By modern standards, with modern laws of war and modern conventions about protecting civilians, what LeMay did would be considered a war crime. But in 1945, it was considered a military operation. Other historians argue that even by the standards of 1945, the Tokyo raid was excessive. They point out that the United States had committed itself to a policy of precision bombing, of targeting military and industrial sites rather than cities as such. The shift to area fire bombing was a departure from that policy, a move toward the kind of terror bombing that the United States had criticized when the Germans and Japanese did it. They argue that LeMay didn't have clear authorization for such a radical change in tactics, that he essentially made the decision on his own to start burning cities. The truth is that LeMay did have authorization, at least implicitly. His superiors in Washington knew what he was planning. They knew that fire raids on Japanese cities would kill large numbers of civilians. They approved the raids because they wanted results, and LeMay was delivering results. The fiction of precision bombing was maintained in public statements, but everyone involved knew what was really happening. The decision to burn Tokyo was made at multiple levels, from LeMay planning the tactics to his superiors, approving the targets to President Truman and his advisors, accepting the overall strategy. LeMay gets the blame or credit because he was the most visible figure and because he never tried to deflect responsibility. He owned what he did. In his memoirs and interviews, LeMay was remarkably blunt. He said that he knew he was killing civilians. He said that it bothered him, but not enough to stop. He said that his job was to win the war, and he did what he thought was necessary to win. He said that if you're not willing to kill to win, you shouldn't start a war. This moral clarity, if you can call it that, made him both admired and reviled. Admired by those who believed that sometimes terrible things must be done. Reviled by those who believed that some things are wrong no matter what the justification. The legacy of the Tokyo raid is complicated. On one hand, it was part of a campaign that helped end World War II, a war of aggression started by Japan and Germany that had killed tens of millions of people. Ending that war sooner rather than later was a moral good. On the other hand, the raid involved the deliberate mass killing of civilians, which is hard to reconcile with any ethical system that values human life and dignity. Both things can be true at the same time. War creates situations where all choices are bad, and you have to choose the least bad option. Whether burning Tokyo was the least bad option is something people still argue about. What's not in dispute is the effectiveness of the raid from a military standpoint. It destroyed a major Japanese industrial center. It demonstrated that Japanese cities could not be defended against determined American attack. It forced the Japanese government to divert resources to civil defense and reconstruction that might otherwise have gone to the military. It created a psychological climate of despair and helplessness among the Japanese population. In all these ways, it contributed to ending the war. Curtis LeMay died in 1990 at the age of 83. He had lived a long life, seen the Cold War come and go, watched the military he helped build win battles and lose wars, witnessed the transformation of air power from bombers to missiles to drones. He never stopped believing that he had done the right thing in 1945. He never apologized. He never backed down. To the end, he was the same hard, unyielding man who had sent 334 bombers to burn Tokyo. The survivors of Tokyo are dying now. 80 years have passed. The youngest people who remember that night are in their late 70s or 80s. Soon, there will be no one left who can say, "I was there, I saw it, I survived it." The memory will become purely historical, preserved in documents and photographs and recorded testimonies, but no longer carried in living minds. That's what happens with all history eventually. The people who lived it die, and what remains is what we choose to remember and how we choose to tell the story. The story of Curtis LeMay and the firebombing of Tokyo is important because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about war and morality, about means and ends, about what we're willing to do to people we define as enemies. There are no easy answers. LeMay had his answers, clear and uncompromising. Others have different answers, equally sincere. What matters is that we keep asking the questions, that we don't forget what happened, that we understand the human cost of the strategic decisions made by men like Curtis LeMay in rooms far from the flames.